The IRS has just published the very first list of qualified intermediaries. They have never done this in the past since the year 2000, and there are some big things in there if you start looking at those numbers. The first is that anecdotally, the IRS has always said the number of QIs, when you take away the number that are terminated each year with the number that are joining the program each year, the average number of QIs is about 5,000. Now the list actually says that number is actually 3,962, which is not a lot less than 5,000. So it's in the right range, but that number in comparison to the total number of financial institutions in the world is very small. In the past, we've made the observation that if there were 5,000 QIs, that means there must be somewhere in the region of 50,000 non-qualified intermediaries. Why do I say that? That's because if you think about it, the US represents over 50% of the world's GDP in the securities markets. It's a market you almost cannot avoid if you are a financial institution that has investors as clients. Those clients want to access the US markets. They access the US markets either through a qualified intermediary or a non-qualified intermediary. If they do so through a qualified intermediary, they're able to get treaty benefits. And there are a number of different markets that have double tax treaties with the United States. If you look at the number of QIs, however, and we did initial analysis, so if I took Malta as an example, Malta has 17 QIs. If you look at the number of GINs, and let me back up a second, just say, if you're trying to estimate the number of financial institutions in any jurisdiction, it's not easy. But one of the guidelines you can use is how many GINs have been issued in that jurisdiction. So the issue here is when you look at the numbers, there are a number of jurisdictions, and I think there are 15 jurisdictions that only have one QI. The Cook Islands is one example. Mauritius is another example. Only one financial institution in Mauritius, which is a well-known jurisdiction for financial institutions to set up. Only one financial institution in Mauritius is a qualified intermediary. I happen to know who they are. They're a withholding QI. Now, that's all well and good, but there are a whole bunch of other things to take from these statistics and the analysis of the IRS's QI list. The one thing you can't do is currently identify and validate the qualified intermediary identification number. So from an industry perspective, what you're trying to do if you are working with a counterparty that's another financial institution, you'll typically ask them for what's called a Form W8IMY. And on that W8IMY, your counterparty will need to put an identifier issued by the United States. If you're a QI, that will be a QI EIN number. If you're not a QI, in other words, if you're a non-qualified institution, then you would just have an EIN. So those two numbers, one of those two types of numbers needs to be on the W8IMY. The problem that you've got is if you receive that tax ID, you've got no way of validating whether that's the correct tax ID for that institution. Now, if you have an American as a client, for example, you can validate the Social Security number against the IRS database. The problem with the QI list that's been published by the IRS is it only contains the last two digits of the QI EIN. So the only thing that you can match against in that list, if you're a financial institution, is the name. Now, the names, as we all know, tend to get truncated and adjusted depending on a whole bunch of factors. So the name may not be the same or exactly the same as the name on the W8IMY, all of which just causes more cost and time in going back to the client and saying, are you the same institution as is listed here at the IRS? What would be really good in the industry terms would be some form of API directly into the IRS's systems to be able to call the QI EIN number and validate it in real time, inline in a certification process. The problem with the entire system of being a QI is that basically under the IRS rules, only a qualified intermediary or a US withholding agent can provide tax treaty benefits to its clients. So if you've only got a very low number of QIs in any given market, That's the only route that an investor from that market can gain treaty benefits. If we use Malta as an example again, so they've got 17 qualified intermediaries. That means from our analysis, there are a much larger number of financial institutions of whatever size that are non-qualified intermediaries. Now, two types of non-qualified intermediary, disclosing and non-disclosing. The reason that you've got those two types is a customer who has an account with a disclosing NQI can get access to treaty benefits because their financial institution can disclose or share their customers' information with a qualified intermediary. So that might be another Maltese financial institution that is a QI. So there is a way in which a non-qualified intermediary can get tax treaty benefits for its customers, but they have to share your information with another financial institution. So the number of times that that happens is relatively low. So generally speaking, most NQIs are called non-disclosing. That means they don't tell anybody who you are as a client. That means that under the US tax rules, any US income that comes in is going to be taxed at 30%. The customers of the 17 QIs, on the other hand, when they get dividends from the US, will get taxed at 15% because that's the double tax treaty rate with US for Malta. If they receive portfolio interest, in other words, income from US corporate or government bonds, that income will be taxed at 0% because there's an exemption on withholding for portfolio interest, as long as the recipient is not US. Now, for a non-disclosing NQI, the counterparty doesn't know who the recipients are because they haven't been told. Therefore, the tax rate is 30%. So that's the first issue, is with a very low number of QIs in any given jurisdiction, that means that there is not a choke point, but a very narrow way in which the investors in that jurisdiction can get access to double tax treaties. The second issue is data protection or data privacy. The reason that I'm talking about data privacy is to do with reporting. So at the beginning of the process, financial institutions have to document who their clients are. They'll do that typically with a form W8. That W8 gets validated. Once it's validated and any tax treaty benefits are claimed, they're applied. You go all the way through the year receiving dividends taxed at 15%. And at the end of the year or early in the following year, that financial institution has to report to the IRS. QIs get to pool their customers, so they don't even disclose their clients to the IRS. So they're pooling their information returns and their tax return based on the type of income and the tax rate that was applied. They don't disclose who their clients are. So this stands in quite stark contrast to the other tax regulation that affects most non-US financial institutions, and that's FATCA. Now, the US got a lot of pushback when FATCA was first brought into effect in 2010, and that was from European financial institutions who said, hang on, you're asking us to share information about our American clients who are living in, let's say, Malta, with you as the US government. The problem is we can't do that because we have European domestic legislation called GDPR, and we can't break domestic legislation in order to meet American legislation, which we're not subject to directly anyway. So in FATCA, the way around that was that the US entered into intergovernmental agreements. And so a FATCA report from a financial institution in Malta doesn't go to the IRS directly, it goes to the Commissioner for Revenue. So the financial institutions in Malta can say, hey, we haven't broken any rules, we gave this information to the Commissioner for Revenue. The Commissioner for Revenue is the one that packages that information up from all of the Maltese financial institutions and then sends that to the IRS. You can argue however much you like about whether the government is subject to GDPR, but that was the reason that the IGAs came into force because of FATCA. What slipped under the radar for everyone is on the other side of that coin, in terms of the taxation of income that I've been describing, any client that gets tax relief, in fact, any client that gets income from the United States, from a QI's perspective is pooled, so there is no data privacy issue. But the client of a non-qualified intermediary does have to get reported directly to the IRS every year. And that particularly impacts non-qualified intermediaries. And again, there are two threads to that conversation. If the NQI is a disclosing NQI, they will be telling a counterparty, usually a QI, who their customers are. They'll be providing what's called a withholding statement, and they'll be providing all of the W-8s that they receive from their customers. In that circumstance, because the financial institution is an NQI, all of their clients must be reported individually. That means that because there was disclosure, it's the counterparty to whom the disclosure that was made that now has the obligation of reporting each and every one of those underlying investors. If the financial institution is a non-disclosing NQI, then it's very simple. It's the NQI's job to report every recipient by income, tax, and tax rate. It doesn't matter what kind of NQI you are, you will have to have your clients individually reported directly to the IRS. That includes their name, their address, their domestic tax identification number, and also the amount of US income they received and the amount of tax that was withheld on that income. All of that goes directly to the IRS every year. Now, that may cause some people to stop and think about whether that breaches or causes the financial institution to breach GDPR in the European context and even in the UK context to that extent. So there is a data privacy issue associated with what's called 1042S reporting, and also, of course, on the taking up of treaty benefits, NQI's clients can't get access to those treaty benefits without disclosure. By reference or inference, that means there are some financial institutions, potentially quite a few, that have not gained QI status because they have never applied. Maybe they don't understand it, but that means that their clients are being taxed at 30% on dividend income when they could be taxed at 15% and not disclosed to anybody. Now, that model can replicate itself across a number of jurisdictions where there's only one QI, and there are 15, I think, jurisdictions in the IRS list where there's only one qualified intermediary for the whole jurisdiction. And you can do an analysis, and I'll show that in a graph. You can do an analysis to look at the number of jurisdictions that have got double tax treaties with the US, but don't have KYC rules approved. And part of the problem here is you can't be a QI in a jurisdiction unless that jurisdiction has its KYC rules approved by the IRS. Now, many of these jurisdictions that don't have approved KYC rules just don't know that there's a process to get them approved. So it's a series of steps that you need to go through, which starts with, has your jurisdiction got approved KYC rules? If not, let's go and get those KYC rules approved, and we can help you do that. That takes an amount of time. Once you've got the KYC rules approved, you will appear, or your jurisdiction will appear on the IRS list of approved KYC jurisdictions. That means now every financial institution in that jurisdiction can apply to be a qualified intermediary. If that jurisdiction also happens to have a double tax treaty with the United States, it means that the financial institutions in that jurisdiction can not only become QIs, but as a result of becoming a QI, can then offer tax treaty benefits to their clients. That's called competitive advantage. The faster you get into that process, the more time you've got to go talk to all of the clients you can get to and say, you either have an account with a non-qualified intermediary, in which case you're going to get taxed at 30%, and your name and address and tax ID number are going to be shared every year with the IRS, or you come and open an account with us and we'll give you 15%, or in the case of China, 10% taxation on dividend income, and your information is not going to be shared with anyone. So that's how these issues tend to be connected. It's a case of joining the dots to make sure that you are maximizing the potential of the regulatory structure to which you're exposed.